Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Again, my name is Courtney Austin, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator here at AIM. Today's webinar will be recorded and later posted on our website, which does mean that during the duration of the webinar, everybody will be automatically muted so that we can get a quality recording. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, we will have a question answer option at the end of the webinar. However, you can also type them into the question box, and we'll try to answer them throughout, or get a marketer to go ahead and follow up with you after. Our next upcoming webinar will be on May 25th at 9 a.m. Pacific time and will be presented by Don Erickson with a special guest of Mutual of Omaha's Adam Chate to go over the IUL options that Mutual of Omaha has. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Mike so that we can get started. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Courtney. Good morning, everybody. As Courtney told you, this is Mike Anderson. I'm Senior Internal Wholesaler here at American Independent Marketing. We appreciate y'all making time to join us here today on this presentation. This is a little bit of new ground for us here, but we're really excited to be able to break that new ground. Better show my screen. A little detail there. Let's see here. All right, there we go. Thanks for that reminder, Court. Okay, so anyway, we got a couple of special guests with us here today. We've got Maria Lara Rivas, who is our account exec. And if you are involved with Mutual of Omaha at all, you've probably had some of Maria's handiwork on your cases. She's an all-purpose, behind-the-scenes, get things done person that we count on a ton. And she's with us here today. And I'm joined by my special guest, Steve Alloy. He's an advanced market specialist at Mutual of Omaha, and as you can see, he's got a law degree and an MBA and a lot of other cool titles behind his name, but what he really brings to us is literally an advanced perspective on this market and a perspective from the carrier position about things that are going on that are certainly have a great potential to be beneficial for us, for yourselves, and for the various carriers out there. And as we go through the next few years, you'll see advanced market team members such as Steve on our calls from time to time, just because we feel like it gives us that different perspective and that different voice as we look at a lot of new and really exciting things. So Steve, take a minute, say hi to our wide-ranging audience. We literally have folks all over the country that are joining us here today, and we'll jump into our Q&A.
Hey, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Courtney, and I want to thank also everybody for calling in today. I'm looking forward to the talk. I always enjoy these.
All right, so obviously a lot of buzz around what happened in Washington last summer. It really got rolling about a year ago. And what this payroll tax situation, that's a generic term, what that's going to mean. So let's start with an easy one, kind of a hanging curveball. Where do you see the overall LTC market going in the next few years?
Well, I think Washington is, and I've described it variously as kind of the canary in the coal mine or something like that. I think Washington, what they're doing there with the payroll tax and everything, is going to, for good or for not good, going to serve as a model to a lot of other states. I think a lot of states are watching what Washington is doing with similar plans in mind, and maybe they want to let Washington execute first and see what happens. But I think a lot of other states are going to go the same way. And I think at the same time, I think that creates a real opportunity for the next several years, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years, maybe. Depends on how long it takes to really roll out to other states. I think it creates a real opportunity in long-term care sales.
We agree, and we like that idea. So now, when we talked before, we talked a little bit about a phenomenon that I think caught a lot of folks off guard in the Washington situation, but you've got a little bit different take on it. And that was that Washington residents were willing to spend, in some cases, a lot more to get that long-term care policy and get away from the tax than what it was that the tax in pure dollars would have cost them. And as I said, you got a little bit different take on that. So weigh in there.
I do. I mean, on the one hand, it was a little surprising because, I mean, so often people just assume that long-term care isn't going to be a problem, or I'll deal with that later or whatever. And so to see a lot of people, calling us up and volunteering, calling advisors up and voluntarily saying, yes, can I get long-term care? That is a little unusual. But in a sense, I guess, when I thought about it a little, I wasn't quite as surprised because, looking at the benefits that the Washington, program is going to offer, I think most people either knew, or certainly if they talked with an advisor, the advisor could tell them that, is the $36,000 lifetime benefit, is that better than having zero lifetime benefit? You probably, but is that really going to be enough to cover you? No. I mean, that will give you a period of time perhaps, but that's really not going to take care of your long-term care needs. And I think just the fact that, because of the payroll tax, they were going to be involved in a long-term care program. Well, really, whether they want to or not, they were going to be involved in one. They thought, well, as long as I'm going to be involved in a long-term care program and I can opt out of this one, which really doesn't provide that much in the way of benefits, why don't I get one that really does the job, that really is going to provide enough benefits for me, is going to be enough to take care of what the real cost might be. So, in a sense, once the objection to action was taken away, because they were going to be part of this, whether, if they did nothing, they were going to be part of the payroll tax. I think that spurred a lot of them to really look at the situation and say, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to do something that's going to be good. It's going to give me enough in the way of benefits, which was, that was nice. That was I guess a good result for them and for a lot of us as well.
Absolutely. There's an old line in an old Rush song that goes, if you choose not to decide, you still made a choice. And that was sort of the position that they found themselves in. And it's worth noting, and I've talked about this on other presentations, that if Mutual of Detroit decided it wanted to bring a long-term care plan into the state of Washington, and they brought in a plan that was going to pay $100 a day for a year, it would have no chance of getting improved, because by definition, a long-term care plan has to be a 2-year plan. And so you had a 1-year plan that doesn't meet the long-term care definition competing against a 2-year plan that any of the different carriers, whether it was a hybrid or whatever, that was what they made available. So it kind of speaks back to what you said. Whether they really understood that or not, I don't know, but certainly they behaved as though they did. So staying with Washington, what did you see as the most surprising piece of the payroll tax dynamic within the state of Washington and all those moving parts?
Yeah, I was a little surprised that I was a little surprised that the opting out ended so much earlier than the actual implementation. And also I was a little surprised too that I was surprised that the opting out ended. I guess I would have liked to have seen kind of a rolling opt out where, even if you're in the program, in kind of a perfect world, I'd say, well, look, even if you're in the program and you realize, at some point you realize this program isn't going to provide the benefits you might need, get some real coverage and opt out of the program. So I guess that was a little surprising. In a sense, it wasn't surprising that the benefits were low because, I think I don't know if I can speak for them, but I think they looked at what they really thought they could get in the way of revenue and what that might do as far as benefits, and it wasn't going to cover a lot. So in that sense, I guess it wasn't that surprising that the benefits were that low, but I just 36,000, I mean, if they took even a quick look at the cost of care in Washington, that they'd know, well, that's not going to do a lot. So that was a little surprising, I guess, too.
Sure. It's well over $200 a day, as a lot of the folks on this call know. So, all right, so staying with Washington, what about what happened there didn't surprise you?
In a way, it's not surprising that they went with a payroll tax as opposed to another tax, because that, politically, that probably is a little easier to sell perhaps than if they added to, income tax or property tax. And in a way that wasn't surprising too, because it's sort of lining it up with employer benefits, making it seem like an employer benefit, even though it's, really a state benefit, but it's kind of looking like, well, you're getting this as a result of your employment. So that wasn't too surprising. It wasn't surprising that they wanted, that they had the whole idea for the act wasn't surprising, because, as we've talked before, every state is looking at, these Medicare costs and or Medicaid costs, and not surprising that states are starting to say, well, what can we do about this? And there have been some federal attempts even, and there's a current federal attempt that probably isn't going anywhere, but not surprising that a lot of states are starting to say, what can we do to, we're not really going to get out of these costs, but at least delay them a little bit, get out of some of them. Maybe there's a balance, somewhere we can kind of balance the costs off a little bit. So that wasn't real surprising that they're looking at that, and not surprising that a lot of other states are too, because Washington's not every state has the same issues.
Yeah, and that kind of, this is a question we were going to get to in a minute, but you kind of teed it up, so we'll go there now. It sets the stage for the politics versus fiscal reality conversation. And as you noted when we were talking before, oftentimes when those things square up, politics carries the day. But it seems like, from what we're seeing in the lineup of states that we are seeing begin to look at this, that we've much more quickly than expected reached the point in time where the fiscal reality piece, it looks like it's going to trump the political piece. So
yeah,
you guys are seeing that. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, in fact, when we were, we talked about this a couple months ago, I think at a conference, and at that time we were saying, well, it's not a big surprise that states like California or Minnesota are also looking at doing something similar. But as we were talking then, we said, at some point, states that act like they don't want to do this, that politically you would not think would be interested in this, are going to do this, because they get, they're going to look at the money and they're going to say, we got to do something. And I didn't know that I didn't know it would be quite so quick, but we've got states, I think Oklahoma, and I think my own state of Nebraska here is, they're both looking at doing something similar. I mean, they're in the early stages still, but I didn't know it would happen that fast. I thought it might be a year or two out, but they're already starting to look at it, because, they have the same issues as every other state.
Yes, they do. And Steve alluded to a meeting that we were both at about 2 months ago.
Yeah.
It was they call it the ILTCI or SOA meeting or whatever, but it's basically the convening of all the brilliant minds in the long-term care space. We were in Raleigh, North Carolina for a few days, but one of the things that came out of that, and I'm just going to run through these really quickly, is an update that NAFA provided on this, and it's where states are in this process. So in the preliminary discussion phase, you've got Illinois, Missouri, Virginia, and Nebraska. And as Steve alluded to, that's a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
Proposed legislation in some form or fashion is bouncing around Minnesota, Colorado, Utah, and Oklahoma being another state where that would consider to be something of a surprise. And in terms of studying, we've got Michigan and California. And California is something that we'll talk about a little bit more here, but that presents in its own, just it's by itself, forgetting about everything else. That presents a series of challenges. And as we talk about all this, it's really important for those of you that remember these days to harken back to your college days, because those were the days when your philosophy professor didn't care that your biology professor had given you 4 hours of homework. They were also going to give you 4 hours of homework. And the more where we're pointing with this is that these states are going to do what they're going to do without consideration to the market. And so we could see ourselves in a situation where we have a Michigan and a Minnesota, or an Illinois or a Minnesota, and these are really population-dense states compared to Washington. But the agents and the marketplace could see this squaring up, and we'll touch on that a little bit more in a few minutes. But just pointing that part out, that this is not going to be. I mean, Washington was a little crazy, but it's not going to be one nice, quaint little state up there in the Northwest. This could really get crazy. So with that in mind, our next question here is, as this next round of states starts to set up and state names become a little bit more public, what looks like it's the most surprising piece from your perspective?
You know, as the states really start to look at this, I'm a couple of things really. In addition to, I'm a little surprised that, you know, in the early rounds here, states like Oklahoma, Nebraska, Utah I would have expected them maybe in a year or two, but they're in this very early on. You know, in addition to that, it's a little surprising, and this is kind of taking you know, a different view perhaps, but it's a little exciting, or a little surprising, I should say, that some of the states that I would have thought would be all over this already are holding off and doing the studies. I'm thinking California in particular. I would have thought California might have been the first state to do this, but I think they're willing to let Washington be the guinea pig. And you know, they've laid out actually. I think the report. I understand it. I think their report is coming out next year, and then like in January, or I think of next year, and then they're really looking at legislation in the following year, in 2024. So that's a little longer a rollout than I might have thought they would do. I might have thought they might even be first, or would certainly be second. But I think other states are going to beat them to second here if they really do follow that schedule. So that was a little surprising with it. And I think, you know, it's a little surprising too that so many people who, you know, and again, kind of from in a political sense, so many people who you would not expect would say, yes, let's create a new payroll tax, are saying exactly that. It's like, let's create a new payroll tax. That's, you know, that's kind of a surprising development for a lot of areas that probably would not have gone for something like this in previous years.
No question. We always believed that eventually it would come down to a situation where the areas that are habitually, if you want to say, tax averse with this kind of thing, that they were going to have no choice, just simply because the financial realities and the potential solution that this brings about would carry the day. And real quick, and this will kind of close out most of what we talk about with the Washington thing. And we've touched on this idea that states are waiting and watching. Here's the update for Washington. This is what all the fuss and muss was about at the beginning of the year during the legislative session. And here are the changes that are anticipated based on that 2022 legislation. Okay. And if you look here in bold, and I can't really make this much bigger than what it is right now, but it's on the WaCares website if you want to go check that out. Basically, they're going to draw a line in the sand and allow folks who are closer to retirement to not be in the program. They can voluntarily be in there, but they're not going to be drug into it. And that was a huge concern. The out-of-state workers, non-immigrant visas, military spouses are all able to opt out. Another huge area of concern. veterans who have a 70% or higher service-connected disability can opt out. Okay, and these were three areas, particularly the out-of-state stuff. The governor of, or the attorney general in Idaho filed a suit, and some other stuff like that. So basically, what they did is they put flame suppressant foam on the areas that had the most heat with these particular things, and kind of quelled those down. It's important for the agents that are looking at this right now to look at this. Okay, nowhere in here does it say that they are going to repeal this. Okay, so when you're talking to people, there's not going to be a repeal. All right, they don't have the votes for it now, barring a massive turnover and restructuring based on who is in the majority after the midterm here coming around the corner in the fall. If that doesn't happen, we're going to stay with this, and they're coming to get the money. The smell of greenbacks is in the air, and so as you look at this, you'll notice, and nowhere in here is there anything that remotely comes close to touching on the idea of repeal. The contributions are going to start being collected in about a year, July 1 of 23. That would make benefits available roughly July 1 of 26. So all the states that are waiting and watching, okay, they're not seeing this, oh my God, we made a mistake, we can't do this. That's not
right.
It's not what's going on here. Okay. So with that, then we'll close out the Washington thing, and we're going to also, this kind of, all of this together sets the stage, and this is something that Steve mentioned when we talked last week about this idea of the golden age of long-term care. So talk about why you see all of this in toto setting the stage for something like this.
You know, I will, but if I could just make one more thought on Washington.
Absolutely.
You know, yeah, I think when they kind of put the brakes on implementation in January, I think some people were hoping, oh, look, they're going to repeal it. Yeah, I would agree with you. No, they're not going to repeal it. I would even say that even if there is a massive political realignment after the elections, you know, I think we're seeing states like Oklahoma and Nebraska and stuff. I think even with a realignment, people are going to come in and say, well, you know, this isn't maybe perfect, but we got to do something, because we can't stay on the Medicaid path that we've been on. So, you know, what do we do? Well, maybe it might change a little bit, but I really don't see any of them repealing this, you know, once it happens. You know, so yeah, I would agree with that. I think this is a trend that is going to stay in place, and kind of leading then into the, you know, this golden age. I really think that as this rolls out to states beyond Washington, you know, over the next, you know, 2, 3, 4 years, kind of depends on how long some of the states take to really implement this. I think as it rolls out, we may one day look back on this as the golden age of long-term care insurance. Because I think as this starts to hit a lot of other states and a lot of individuals in those states, they're going to have the same reaction that a lot of the people in Washington did. They're going to say, look, I mean, if I'm going to be taxed anyway, and if I get an opt-out, which I think we'll talk about potential opt-outs here in a little bit too, but if I'm going to get an opt-out, if I'm going to have to pay anyway, why, you know, look, I want coverage that's going to be effective. I mean, I don't necessarily want coverage that's not going to be enough. If I'm going to pay, maybe I'll pay a little more, and I'll get something that's actually going to work, rather than, you know, something that'll work for 6 months and then, ooh, sorry, you know, it's gone. So I really think the next handful of years is a tremendous opportunity for long-term care insurance sales. Maybe the best we've seen, and I think as a result of these laws going in place, I think it's really going to spur a lot of long-term care sales over the next few years.
Well, as a Washington survivor, because we're based right here and we were right in the middle of it,
Yeah.
I would concur with that assessment. There was an incredible opportunity there. The carriers got caught off guard a little bit, and we'll look at that here in a minute. But during that brief period of time when everything was in play, hybrids, worksite, traditional, there was a ton of activity and a ton of interest. And it's worth noting, the interest never went away. we built a website. Most of the agents that work with us are aware of that, particularly the ones in Washington. And part of that website was actually generating inquiries, leads, if you will. And before you lose your mind and about this, we were dispersing those out to agents, but we were still getting those leads at the end of September, which was the very end of the period of time when you had to have the long-term care policy in your hands. I mean, so people were still finding out about this and raising their hands and saying, hey, what can we do with this? And there wasn't anything to do at that point in time, but that interest carried right until the very end. So now you touched on opt-outs a minute ago, and so it's a good time to talk about this, which we think is going to be part of this, just from a standpoint of the fiscal reality and the unintended benefit of what happened here, which is 500,000 people being now positioned in the private insurance lane. But do you see scenarios going forward with where a state like a Washington or maybe other states would actually plan for sequenced phases to allow the industry, because everybody realized quickly that the industry got swamped, that would allow the industry to manage it better simply by saying, okay, phase 1 is here, phase 2 is here, et cetera. Do you see that as a realistic possibility?
I would hope so. Hopefully that's going to be one of the takeaways that a lot of this, if these states are watching Washington, hopefully that's one of the things that they'll catch, is that look, if we really want to make this opt-out real and legitimate, we're going to have to give an extended period of time, and maybe even after the law is implemented, maybe even a ex post facto opt-out, just because our industry was overwhelmed with Washington. I mean, I can only imagine if we get California, and there's a short window on it, or if we get Michigan, Illinois, or Michigan, Minnesota, it's almost to California there. We'd probably shut down day one. So it would be, there would be an opt-out time, but there wouldn't effectively be any way to opt out, because the carriers just wouldn't be able to handle it. So hopefully that will be one of the takeaways. I guess I'd like to see that they would say, we're going to give a long opt-out time, maybe even after the law is in place. Maybe there really is, in a sense, there wouldn't be an end to the opt-out, that you could opt out a year into the law. You'd say, well, hey, as long as I'm paying this, I'll get something good, and you could opt out at that point. I guess I'd kind of like to see that, and hopefully that will be a takeaway.
Yeah, and it looks like, from what we're hearing, that some of the states are eyeing what I'm calling a no exemption model, meaning everybody gets taxed.
Right.
I don't think that turns out to be a good thing, but I'm in the long-term care sales business. But do you see any part of that potentially as being positive?
Well, I guess it would be positive to the program if they wouldn't have to worry about losing the tax base. They could probably provide more benefits. But as far as positive to the end user, it's kind of hard to think that would be an ultimate real plus for the individuals, because I don't, as much as good as their intentions might be, I don't think anybody's really going to have much better benefits than the Washington law does. Just looking at the taxation and the costs and everything, it'd be hard to get a whole lot better than that unless they have a really big tax on payroll. But so I guess the only plus would be that it would help the program operate maybe a little better and make it less likely to fail, because with long-term care, with the cost of care, underwriters have had historically a difficult time pinning that down, historically, and I don't think these laws are any different. I think they might even have a more difficult time pinning down the costs. So I think there is a potential that some of these programs might not make it. They're taking in tax dollars, but they may not really have enough to provide even the benefits that they're describing. So that would be that's maybe about the only plus I would say to a non opt out. But I have heard, I think some states are considering that. I don't know that anyone's put that into legislation or anything yet, but I think some of the states are looking at where they would tax everybody, and you wouldn't necessarily have to take the benefits, but you would have to pay the tax.
Right. It's worth noting, kind of at the midpoint here, the wild card in all this is different states have different guidelines, if you want to call it that, rules in the Constitution that state buffer periods that have to exist when a bill's signed into law before it can be implemented. I'm not a scholar on that. Steve's not a scholar on that. So that, with a potential Minnesota, Michigan, whatever, Colorado, whatever state you want to talk about, that's a wild card that we're not getting into with this. So setting aside exemption, and we've talked about that at some length here this morning, what do you see as elements that the new states, this new bunch of states, need to pay better attention to have their proverbial better mousetrap?
I think they should look at the actual cost of care. And, if they're going to design a program, I would say, I guess what I'd like to see them look at it and look at the actual cost of care, look at what they really can realistically expect in tax revenue, and say, if we're going to design something that is going to pay for itself with this payroll tax, let's design something that we maybe admit is only going to last a short period of time. It's like a short term, almost like an elimination period insurance. Rather than saying, hey, we're going to provide long-term care coverage. And, it's going to be fairly short term. I think if somebody really goes into a nursing home, it's not going to last very long. So I guess I'd like to see kind of that balance, with what they can really expect to take in and what they're saying this law is going to cover. If they say, well, look, it's only designed to provide a short-term benefit to keep the Medicaid from bankrupting the state, or to give you, maybe on the individual side, this will give you coverage during so you can get a longer elimination period on a policy. I guess that would be a nice balance to see.
And we talked about this last week. Speaking of balance, okay, hybrid products. It seems like they really became something that the general public was aware of existed, whether it's an annuity long-term care hybrid or a life long-term care hybrid, those different kinds of things. When you and I were talking, you threw out the idea that a 50-50 split between hybrids and then between the individual and the work site and those kinds of things as maybe being the best hope to keep the industry and the carriers in the game longer. Talk about that a little, if you would, please.
Yeah, I really, and certainly as everyone on the call knows, the hybrid products are, very, very popular, whether hybrid or long-term care riders. I mean, we don't have a true hybrid, but we have a long-term care rider on life policies. Those have become very, very popular, and I think which I'm glad to see, and I'd like to see more of that. Also, I think when we get laws like Washington's, I think it's up to the carriers to look at, hey, do we need to design, rather than just a regular hybrid, which those are good. I mean, I'm glad we have those, but maybe we need to design something a little bit different that is that's designed to pick up coverage once the state benefits are gone, almost like a supplement, almost like a Medicare supplement in some ways, that would cover, a policy that would cover what the state law doesn't cover, the state benefits don't cover. And I think that's a challenge to, I think, the carriers going forward. Might be a little difficult on the carriers because the states may have vastly different benefit schemes, but in a way I don't think they're going to be that different, because I don't you look at the costs and you look at what they can reasonably bring in. I think the balance is probably, I think most of them are going to come down somewhere around where Washington is. Really, it might be a little more, a little less, but I don't know that a state can really reasonably expect to take in enough to do a lot better than that. Based on the populations of the states. So I guess I would like to see the carriers begin to create, new products with maybe longer eliminations, or, hey, this is designed to kick in once this is designed to be really secondary long-term care. Once the state benefit's gone, then this would kick in, something along those lines. And, I guess we'll see, but I think if we want those products in the next couple of years, the carriers ought to probably be talking about it right now.
Absolutely, and it's worth noting, and the folks that are on the phone that work with this routinely are certainly aware of this, that there are some pretty good, I'd categorize them as pretty good short-term care products that are out there. Unfortunately, those are products that aren't approved in Washington, or weren't approved in Washington, still aren't. Not approved in California, because you pretty much can't get anything approved down there. Yeah. And ironically enough, not approved in Minnesota, which sets the stage for two of the areas presumed to be poised for the next go-round. They don't have that relief valve. And I agree with what Steve said. Something is better than nothing, just from a standpoint of being able to help folks out and do it in a way that's, that is more affordable than, than these different things that we saw. And one of the things we expect with a Minnesota or a Michigan or wherever is that once there is an awareness of, the different timeframes and such, we expect relatively quickly and independently, although it may not look that way, that the carriers are going to come back out and say, okay, in state X, minimum monthly benefit is $3,000 a month. Minimum pool amount is 2 years, okay, or 3 years. And, whether you got to have inflation or not, they're not necessarily going to address that, but put themselves in a situation where they're generating, where they got enough coverage that it's meaningful, which is a carrier concern. And then also, at some level, they got to generate enough cost to be able to underwrite these policies, because not everybody that applies is a healthy 30-year-old who's been to the doctor one time since they got out of college. And I mean, that's there. So from a standpoint of, let's call that market equity, what do you see going on with that?
Well, and that's one of the things that I have to hope that the carriers are going to look at when they're designing products based on these state laws. And I would agree. I mean, I think for a carrier to put out a product that is not going to provide enough, or not going to provide adequate care, it's kind of, might have a tough time getting approved. That certainly I don't think it would sell very well. I think if Mutual or any other carrier came out with a product that costs what the Washington state law is going to cost, and provided the benefits it's going to provide, we probably would get rejected by the insurance commission. So, hopefully that is going to be a standard, and it might mean higher premiums, but there's, on the other hand, it might not, because if a lot of these states have something in place, then, and particularly if it's a no exemption state, then we can say, well, all right, say if California does no exemptions, all right, well, anybody in California, we know that they've got, let's say 36,000 that can get them started. So maybe, they're not going to get $1 out of us. So that might, not increase. I hesitate to say decrease, because I don't know if it would decrease premiums, but it might not necessarily increase premiums, because we know that there'd be, in theory, less paid out, or start paying out later. So yeah, I'd like to see that.
All right, so let's set aside California for purposes of this next question. How would the industry, or can the industry, handle a Minnesota-Illinois combination where they're running roughly on the same track on that same time frame? Is it realistic to be able to do that, or do you see a situation where just the whole thing stops?
I would, unfortunately, I'm thinking the whole thing would stop. I mean, as far as watching Washington, I mean, in addition to the states watching Washington, a lot of the carriers, I think, maybe learned something from the Washington experience as well. But I don't think the capacity has. I mean, I don't think the capacity's gotten changed in any way since the shutdowns as a result of the Washington, the rush of business that came in. And I got to think too, when you get more populated states, I mean, there's a decent population in Washington, but when you get a state like, California, certainly, or even Michigan, we had a pretty sizable population, Illinois, you get some states like that. I'd like to think that carriers could handle it, but I really don't think so. I don't think they can. I think it would be a similar thing where they'd have to shut down at some point.
Yes, that's a concerning element. So, all right, what parts of this, you observed it, you're kind of in the middle of it simultaneously with Mutual and all these other things are setting up. What, with regard to this long-term care future, golden age of long-term care, what have we not talked about this morning that agents should be aware of, maybe be concerned about, maybe positioning themselves to deal with going forward?
I would think that just given the likelihood that the industry can't really handle, the rush of business once it becomes official, I guess I would encourage all the producers to, talk about this with clients and say, look, maybe it's not happening if you live in Washington, it is happening in your state. But, if you don't live in Washington, say, look, it's not happening here yet, but they're talking about it. By the time it really happens, it might be tough to get coverage to be able to exempt out, assuming we can even exempt out. But it might be tough to get that coverage. Why don't let's get something in place now, because this is coming. I mean, I think certainly use the example of, Utah, Oklahoma, Nebraska, not states where you'd say it's likely they're going to raise taxes, but yeah, they are. they're looking at doing exactly the same thing. So, this is coming to your state at some point, and taking care of it now could solve a whole lot of problems later. You'd have the coverage in place that you might not be able to get at down the road, and assuming there's an exemption, you'd have a built-in exemption already. So I would say, that's the only thing we haven't talked about is it's the golden age, but it might last the next 2, 3, 4 years, but I think it's on right now. I mean, I'd start getting people getting covered, immediately based on what's going to happen in the next 2, 3 years.
There you go. So with that in mind, we'll talk a little bit about agents' preparation. And Stephen sort of bumped up against this here a minute ago. You're going to need to prepare, the agents out there, you're going to need to prepare to be able to talk both combo products, life long-term care, and traditional. All right. And the reason I say that is because in Washington, good old Washington, with 4 million people in the workforce, a lot of folks lose sight of the fact that the traditional portion of the market shut down in 6 weeks. Okay. It went from nobody knowing about it in April to going and blowing in May, and by the middle of June, they were all done. Okay. And the trailing pieces that did happen involved carriers continually bumping up benefits and minimum premiums and things like this. But the purest, if you want to call it that, part of this was over and done with in 6 weeks. All right. We were fortunate here in that there was a viable worksite option. There's not in California. It's worth noting. And so that's not a way where you can bleed off 10,000 policies or 15,000 policies. Something like that just doesn't exist down there. So you have to be able to, you have to operate in a situation where you're versed in multiple things. Good idea to get yourself versed and contracted, and that's the other important part for worksite. We've got that. We can take care of you there. Get yourself ready to go with the hybrid products, the combo products, the One Americas, the Lincolns, Mutual of Omaha, and the life part of Mutual of Omaha, which is United of Omaha. They've got a nifty, easy to understand product there that we can avail you of. We've got an annuity hybrid with Gillico. We've got Securian, which is one of the 10 biggest life insurance carriers in the world, and they're available with combo products. So there's a lot of things that are out there as choices, and we've talked before about this idea that you're probably going to pick up what we call the AIM bonus six-pack. That would be 7 carriers from scratch, depending on your state, to be able to take care of all the potential scenarios that you are going to deal with. And you also want to make sure that your CE is good to go and it's current. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea just to get it done now and not get caught in the middle. All right. And then make sure you've got E&O up and running, current, all those kinds of little detail things. Those are the kind of details that you don't want to have your production sabotaged by not paying attention to. So, all right, well, we are right at 45 minutes after the hour. So what